The Polish soldiers at Wizna were exhausted, but none dared show it as dawn broke over the misty landscape on September 7, 1939. The men of Captain Władysław Raginis' command had spent days preparing their defensive positions, knowing well that the German advance was closing in on them like an iron fist. The fields around the narrow river, once peaceful and quiet, now felt charged with static tension. The men moved through trenches, bunkers, and machine gun nests cut into the earth, preparing for what they already understood would be a hopeless fight. Still, they readied their artillery, reinforced their ammunition stores, and looked over the river toward the horizon that promised only fire. Raginis walked slowly along the lines, boots brushing through dry brush, checking in on men he knew by name. He paused beside Christoph, who sat in the trench with worry etched across his young face. Raginis gave him a firm pat on the shoulder, whispering encouragement that he hoped would hold the man's spirit together. All around them, troops glanced anxiously toward Wizna, each sensing the Germans would appear at any moment. Their commander's calm presence steadied them, but even he understood how overwhelmed they would soon be. The stillness shattered with a sudden explosion that rolled across the river like thunder. Earth trembled violently under their feet as artillery shells slammed into the Polish positions. Shouts filled the trenches as soldiers scrambled toward the safety of the bunkers. Dust, dirt, and jagged fragments burst into the air, and within moments thick plumes of smoke choked the battlefield. The bombardment continued without pause, shells falling in a relentless rhythm, smashing into soil and steel, rupturing the ground in violent fountains of debris. Aircraft followed overhead, dropping bombs whose booming detonations drowned out even the screams of the wounded. Inside one of the bunkers, a soldier grabbed the field telephone, shouting the words that everyone had been dreading. The Germans had arrived in force. Fires kindled along the dry brush, spreading rapidly across the trenches. After half an hour of bombardment, the explosions halted abruptly. Silence replaced sound so completely that the men could hear their own shallow breathing echoing against the concrete walls. It was an unnatural silence, the kind that left the soldiers frozen, terrified to raise their heads even an inch. Then a lookout spotted movement through the drifting smoke. German tanks, an entire division, were approaching the river, their silhouettes unmistakable. Orders echoed through the bunkers, below the bridge. Men rushed to their positions and waited, timing the demolition as the enemy drew closer. At the exact moment the tanks reached the structure, a massive eruption ripped the bridge apart in a cascade of splintered wood and metal. Vehicles tumbled into the river, and the ground shook violently under the blast. The Germans fell into chaos, scrambling for cover while their infantry opened fire wildly at the Polish bunkers. Inside the Polish fortifications, the men remained absolutely still, trusting the thick reinforced concrete walls to keep them alive. Bullets hammered the outer plates, leaving sparks and dents, but failing to penetrate. When the German fire subsided, the Poles cautiously returned to their firing positions. The tanks remained stalled, but infantry began creeping forward from the town buildings. Two Polish lookouts studied the advancing figures through narrow firing slits. They saw several officers, important ones, by their confident posture and the way others kept close to them. One soldier's hand hovered over his machine gun, torn between the temptation to fire and the fear of prematurely exposing their position. But he lost his chance. The machine gun in a bunker across the river roared to life, its long, punishing burst tearing into the German officers and dropping them instantly. The Germans panicked, shouting for retreat. The Poles unleashed their anti-tank rifles next. The thunderous gunshots cracked across the battlefield, the heavy bullets striking at the German armor. Some ricocheted harmlessly, but others punched through weaker spots, sending shrapnel slicing into the crews inside. Tank operators were thrown into confusion, their retreating transmissions broadcasting warnings through their radios. The tanks pulled back under fire, while German shells crashed into the bunkers, attempting to silence them. None succeeded. Back at Gorostrekowa, Captain Raginis received the updates with a grim nod. Their early success had been impressive, but he knew it was only the beginning. The Germans had the advantage in numbers, armor, artillery, and air power. The night was long and sleepless. The Poles endured sporadic artillery fire that shook the ground and made rest impossible. Before dawn, the explosions quieted and a cold fog rolled over the river. As morning settled in, visibility dropped to nearly nothing. The Poles strained their ears instead. Engines rumbled faintly in the mist, and then the warning reached them. Tanks were entering the river. Men rushed to their anti-tank positions, gripping cold metal rifles. The fog thickened, and then the silhouettes of German panzers emerged like ghosts. The Poles opened fire immediately, but the Germans pushed through the water, firing their cannons toward the Polish lines. Behind them, boats full of infantry rowed forward through the fog. Machine gun fire erupted from the bunkers, cutting down dozens of exposed German soldiers before they could reach cover. But the tanks fired high-explosive rounds that smashed into the Polish positions, sending fragments in every direction. More Poles fell as the panzers advanced relentlessly. The anti-tank riflemen hit one tank, damaging its tread, and the Poles cheered as it ground to a halt. But for each one they damaged, several more pressed forward. Suddenly, Polish artillery joined the fight. Shell after shell tore into the German formations. Explosions blasted infantry into the air and shook the tank operators inside their vehicles. Some tanks were obliterated outright, their hulls blown open by powerful direct hits. Others staggered under the bombardment, but the Germans kept coming, clinging to their advance under a storm of fire. Inside the bunkers, the Poles fired non-stop, their machine guns sweeping the riverbank. The entire battlefield devolved into a violent duel of artillery, machine gun fire, and tank shells. Yet the Germans had no fortifications to shelter in. They were exposed in open terrain, surrounded by craters and wrecks. It was becoming clear their position was unsustainable. One officer attempted to report to Raginis, shouting into the phone over the deafening noise. Their line was holding, but they needed more artillery support. Before he could finish, the next wave of German shells struck the ground, but these did not explode. Instead, they hissed and erupted with plumes of white smoke that blanketed the battlefield. High explosive shells continued to rain around them, but now everything was smothered in a blinding fog. The Poles stood rigid in their bunkers, fingers on triggers. Every man feared the same thing. The Germans were preparing to push through under the cover of smoke. The air thickened until even shapes a few meters away blurred into ghostly shadows. Each moment stretched long and tense, the soldiers straining to hear footsteps or the clatter of tank tracks. The next attack felt imminent. The remnants of the Polish defense had fought until their bodies ached, until their rifles ran hot, until their lungs stung from smoke and gunpowder. When the final German push came and the forward positions collapsed under the pressure, the handful of surviving Polish defenders had no choice but to pull back. They retreated across the river under a black and moonless sky, moving quietly through the reeds and the wet earth. It was not victory in any sense, only survival for those too wounded and exhausted to continue the impossible fight. Only 11 men remained from the original group, 11 battered soldiers who had endured an assault far beyond anything they had ever trained for. As they stumbled towards safety, one of them whispered that they were nearly out of ammunition. Another insisted that falling back to the main bunkers was the only way left to continue resisting. They were not cowards. They were simply men who had reached the absolute limit of what human endurance could achieve. When they emerged near the Polish lines, one of the sentries raised his weapon and shouted for the password. A half-joking answer, "Like and subscribe," was spoken by one of the exhausted survivors, a dark-humored jest born from the delirium of battle and the relief of reaching friendly forces. The men were brought inside, where Captain Władysław Raginis listened carefully to their account. Now it was his turn to assume the burden of decision. The forward line had fallen. The Germans were preparing their next move, and he needed information. He reached for the field telephone and contacted Captain Franciszek Schmidt, who commanded the second bunker complex in the nearby village of Korpiki. Raginis informed Schmidt of the situation and asked him to send out a scouting detachment to observe German movements and report back as soon as possible. Schmidt answered without hesitation. Within minutes, he assembled a small team and led them out toward the river, taking the same hidden route the survivors had used. Their boots sank silently into the soft banks of the dried swamp as they advanced through the dim light of early morning. When Schmidt and his scouts reached the abandoned forward positions, what they found was destruction on a scale that pushed the limits of what the human mind could absorb. Trenches had been torn apart by artillery. Equipment lay scattered like broken bones. The bodies of fallen comrades were half buried in collapsed earth. The German assault had left nothing untouched. But Schmidt pushed his men to continue. Reaching a slight rise overlooking the riverbank, he spotted movement below. German infantry were already gathering near the opposite shore. A pontoon bridge was under construction. the German engineers working quickly and skillfully as armored vehicles waited in line to cross. Some tanks and small units of infantry had already made it over, spreading out cautiously on the Polish side. One of Schmidt's men asked whether they should open fire, but Schmidt refused. Their mission was reconnaissance, not combat. Every bullet needed to be saved for the battle ahead. He observed long enough to be certain of what the Germans were planning. Then he ordered his team back. They hurried through the underbrush, slipping between collapsed trenches and burnt trees, until finally the familiar shape of their bunker appeared ahead. Once inside, Schmidt delivered a full report to Captain Raginis, explaining everything he had witnessed, including the rapid German bridge construction. Raginis listened in silence before issuing new orders. The artillery crews prepared their guns and began shelling the German staging area. Every Polish soldier checked his weapon, inspected his magazines, and steeled himself for the inevitable clash. Time crawled forward under the distant shaking of artillery fire. Then the drone of aircraft engines rolled across the field like thunder. German dive bombers swooped in with renewed fury, dropping their bombs along the Polish defensive line. Men caught outside tripped and dove into whatever shallow depressions they could find as the ground heaved beneath them. Each explosion drew the breath from their lungs. But eventually, the bombers withdrew, leaving an eerie quiet in their wake. That quiet did not last. German infantry appeared in the tree line, moving cautiously from tree to tree. The first muzzle flashes came from the Polish bunkers, followed by the sharp crack of rifles and machine guns. Germans fell in the grass, but more took their place. The attackers reached one of the trenches and slipped inside, using it as cover as they fired back. A stalemate took hold, each side pinned down, waiting for reinforcement or for an opportunity. Hours passed until an unmistakable rumble rolled across the battlefield. It grew louder, deeper, heavier, until metal silhouettes crested the horizon. 60 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division arrived, their engines roaring as they spread across the field. The panzers opened fire almost immediately. Their shells slammed against the concrete of the Polish bunkers, sending vibrations through the thick walls and filling the air with dust. The Polish anti-tank rifles fired back, but were hopelessly outmatched. The armor of the German tanks absorbed everything. The first bunker took the brunt of the attack. Inside, the defenders continued fighting, shouting orders through the crash of explosions. The Germans fired relentlessly, hammering the structure until the concrete weakened. Finally, a shell penetrated the bunker. There was a blinding flash, and then silence. The first bunker had fallen. German infantry stormed inside and secured it. But across the road in Korpiki, Captain Schmidt still held firm. Surrounded on all sides by gunfire, he and his men fired from every firing slit and port in their bunker. German shells smashed into the exterior walls, shaking the room and spraying fragments of concrete. The Poles continued shooting until Schmidt suddenly shouted to his men to fix bayonets. In a burst of desperate courage, the Polish soldiers charged out of the ruined bunker, screaming as they ran across the open ground and straight into the enemy line. The Germans hesitated, startled by the ferocity of the attack. Some broke ranks and tried to fall back. Others fired wildly, but many Polish soldiers reached them, stabbing and striking with bayonets, rifles, and whatever weapons they had left. The sudden assault shattered the cohesion of the German squad, leaving bodies scattered across the field. Against all odds, Schmidt's men pulled back to their bunker, making it inside with most of them still alive. But their success only delayed the inevitable. German artillery resumed its relentless bombardment. The trenches outside were obliterated. The bunker was struck again and again. Soon German troops entirely surrounded the structure and shouted for the Poles to surrender. Schmidt refused and continued firing. But a panzer rolled forward, its turret rotating until it aimed directly at the bunker entrance. The shell that followed struck with devastating force, sending shrapnel flying through the room. Schmidt, his machine gunner, and 3 other men were hit. The Germans pounded on the doors from outside. Realizing there was no hope of continuing the fight, Schmidt finally surrendered to save the lives of the few men still capable of walking. Now only Captain Raginis' bunker remained. The defenders were exhausted, badly outnumbered, and nearly out of ammunition. German infantry closed in again and again, trying to force their way through the narrow entrances, but the Poles repelled each attempt with machine gun bursts and grenades. Hours passed in this cycle of attack and resistance. The Germans shouted demands for surrender. The Poles answered with gunfire. But every bullet fired brought them closer to an unavoidable truth. Their ammunition was almost gone. Raginis looked at his men and wondered whether they wished to continue fighting to the last, or whether they deserved the chance to live after their extraordinary resistance. They had already fought far longer and inflicted far more damage than anyone could have expected. Finally, Raginis made his decision. He gathered his men and thanked them for their loyalty, bravery, and sacrifice. He told them it was time to lay down their arms. Opening the bunker door, he allowed his soldiers to walk out one by one. The Germans grabbed and disarmed them, but did not shoot. When the last man exited, Raginis closed the door behind him. A moment later, a single explosion echoed from within. Captain Władysław Raginis had taken his own life rather than surrender. Raginis had commanded 720 Polish soldiers. They had held off a German force of 42,000 men, supported by 450 tanks, over 100 heavy howitzers, and nearly 60 additional artillery pieces. When the battle finally ended, he was posthumously awarded the Gold and Silver Crosses of the Virtuti Militari and the Grand Cross of the Order of Polonia Restituta. His stand became one of the most heroic and iconic acts of resistance in the entire September campaign.